some of you are familiar with Passenger, and some of you are not. So I just want to talk a little bit about Passenger. So Passenger is a recovery community center, and we focus on, we offer free services for people in recovery or who are interested in recovery. And we do more of a focus on like holistic healing through music and the arts. And that's about it on my end. If you guys want like more information, you could talk to Chris during the networking events, or we have some pamphlets that have a schedule of our programming. And then I'm very excited to introduce some of our community partners, because this topic is very important to me, and I'm sure a lot of people in the room. So I wanted to introduce Amanda from Healing by Choice and Amy from FAN. I'm going to give them a few minutes to talk about their respective organizations, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Sure. My name is Amy. I'm the Recovery Community Coordinator at FAN, Face Addiction Now, formerly Families Against Narcotics. FAN is a statewide program. It's a grassroots nonprofit organization that serves individuals and families affected by substance use disorder. Chris worked with us, and he was a great team member until he came to Passenger and started things here, and started hopefully a lifelong friendship between FAN and Passenger. We do have clinical services, and we also offer RCO type groups. We have yoga, men's group, women's group, a trans non-binary, Monday meditation, online group, recovery dharma, and quick response teams. We have community partners, and we educate the community on substance use disorder. I do have a card back there and a few flyers for our groups. And if you have any questions, you can call me, talk to me, email me, check out our website. Our central office is located in Macomb County, so a lot of our in-person events are held there. But we do have some online offerings, and all of our services are statewide.
And then Amanda, so I'm a member owner of Booksui, which is a bookstore cooperative down the street, and I have some of my colleagues here. Amanda is actually part of an awesome co-op I found out through Booksui, so they're like a sister co-op of ours. So she's going to talk about Healing by Choice and the awesome work that they do as well.
All right. So I am Amanda Hill. I use she and her pronouns. I am the director / mage of operations of Healing by Choice, which is a circle of women and gender nonconforming healers and like wellness practitioners. We run the gamut between energy work, like Reiki. For instance, I'm a Reiki practitioner, and also an acu-detox technician, which is like the ear acupuncture. And some of our folks do Tai Chi, craniosacral massage, art healing. We kind of run the gamut. We have a therapist in the group as well. And what our main focus is just showing up where we're called. We like to ask the question of ourselves every single year. We do like a visioning session to kick off the spring. And the question, a la Grace Lee Boggs, is what time is it on the clock of the world? And so we try not to disconnect healing and like personal wellness from community and like the societal structures and things that impact us on a daily basis and that kind of lead to the fact that we need to heal. And so it's a both and. A lot of the work that we do is with organizations, grassroots organizations who are doing different sorts of justice work, whether that be, we've had a youth focus, and we started last year where we started doing a healing arts youth program. We're finding that young people in schools are having a really hard time since the pandemic especially. And this year we did more of a caregiver focus where we did a lot of, it's really still kicking off, but we did a healing justice practice space specifically for caregivers back in July, where we invited people who caregive for, say, their work or their parenting, or they are community care workers. That's caregiving as well on a wider scale. So we invited those folks to just participate in different healing modalities that maybe they don't have access to on a regular basis. And we also launched the Motor City Mobile Wellness Cooperative. That is a part of the Cooperative Economic Network of Detroit, which Booksui is also a part of. And that group is learning tactics for de-escalation, for rapid response, and was born out of one of the co-founders of that cooperative having lost her daughter to SIDS, and instead of being met with care, was met with cops showing up to her home and like finding weed somewhere and trying to make a connection between those things and like criminalize her as opposed to supporting the family through that moment. Like they took her son. It was a whole very traumatic thing. And so members of Healing by Choice joined with that community healer who's also a therapist to create Motor City Mobile Wellness and skill up so that we could respond and be a place that people can call when they don't want to involve cops in something that they're seeking care for. So that was a lot. And we have some information in the back table. There's a few wellness zines that we created. We kind of compiled a list of different types of support services, like different individual practitioners, as well as like housing, food resources, that sort of thing, into one place, because we find that as Healing by Choice and as Motor City Mobile Wellness, we get a lot of calls asking like, who can I go to for this and that? And so just trying to like weave those pieces together so people aren't having to look all over the place, because when you're in crisis, you don't really have access to the wherewithal to like find everything that you need. So, okay.
Thank you so much, Amanda. So the purpose of this event is, I know a lot of us in the room, if not all of us in the room, are care workers. We're sober sponsors, parents, work in as peer recovery coaches, therapists, mental health workers, community organizers, or just, being that support system for our community. I was inspired when I started volunteering for Passenger back in April. I was really inspired by the work that Brian, he's not here, but he's the director of programming here at Passenger, and the work that Chris was doing. And, I had read Rose's book, which, I in my early on recovery a year ago, Rose's book kind of like, I read it and it kind of just catapulted my love of literature again, and it kind of got me through my own sobriety. So I put two and two together. I'm like, I think these two things are connected. And I've known Rose for a long time, and seeing how much she cares for her Detroit, it's inspiring. So on that note, this is Rose Hackman, everybody.
Thank you so much, Jean. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to be able to speak with you all today, because it is rare. This book came out a year and a half ago, that I really get to be in conversation with a lot of people who are as hands-on as you all are. So I thought what I would do is I would tell you a tiny bit about myself, a tiny bit more about what brought me to write this book, why I think it's important, and a few of the key takeaways I'd love to share with you. And then I'd love to be in conversation. And I'm excited to see how it lands and whether it lands. Maybe it doesn't at all. So my name is Rose Hackman. I actually live in Detroit. I know I don't sound like I live in Detroit, but I've been here on and off since 2013. I'm a journalist by training. So I moved here summer of 2013 when the bankruptcy was declared. At the time, I was a freelance writer, but I quickly became a features writer for The Guardian, which is a British newspaper, but with an international reach and coverage. I, by training, was really an inequality reporter. I really focused on socioeconomics. but I've always considered myself a feminist. And the way in which I came about this topic was back in 2015. I was back in New York, and I had an editor who very excitedly assigned me this topic, emotional labor. And she said, Rose, write an article about emotional labor as the next feminist frontier. I thought it was a very lame topic. So, which is ironic, because here we are 9 years later, and this is basically what I spend at least half of my time talking and thinking about. I was proven sorely wrong. The reason I thought it was a boring, lame topic is I thought emotional labor, it sounds like a silly little thing that privileged housewives on the Upper East Side of Manhattan complain when they don't have anything else left to complain about. Privileged white women who are complaining about their husbands not picking up their socks. But I took the assignment because I had no choice. And what I discovered was that it was not at all silly, but it maybe came across as such. And actually, that's one of the big obstacles that I've had to face in the last year and a half, as I've not just so much promoted a book, but really tried to spread some of the ideas behind the book, which is that we love, the number one way in which we can ignore a topic that's really important is to dismiss it as small or unimportant, or in this case, feminine. And so I hope to convince you all that it's actually quite important. So what is emotional labor? I'll give you the academic definition, and then I'll give you the kind of updated definition that I came to use. Emotional labor is a term that was coined 4 decades ago by a sociologist who's out of Berkeley, who's still alive and complete badass. She's in her 80s, still writing, and I got to interview her for the book, and she actually blurbed the book too. It was a huge honor. So in 1983, Arlie Hochschild, who's a sociologist who was really interested in economics, basically noticed that as manufacturing was no longer taking up as much space in terms of share of the economy, it was on the decline in America, that there was a new form of work that was very, very particular. It was a service work. And she thought that the words that we had to define work were not sufficient to really understand what was being required of workers now. So emotional labor was coined, and she posited that just the same way in which people working in, let's say, a manufacturing job will manipulate, let's say, their arm to execute on the needs of a job, people in the service sector were expected to manipulate their hearts for the needs of a job. So her book on this topic was called The Managed Heart. And she did a really great set of studies with flight attendants. And she described the way in which flight attendants were not so much in airplanes to hand out food and snacks and beverages, but were really, really there to convey a feeling to passengers. They were there to make passengers feel calm. At the time, flying was still very exclusive, so they were maybe even there to make passengers feel sexy and important. And they actually ended up being the face of the company. They actually built, in many ways, the reputation of what we thought of as airlines. And she equated this form of work in professional settings with a form of work that we had long been accustomed to see women do in private, which is emotion work. For the next 40 years, this was studied profusely in academia. The idea that emotional labor, just like physical labor, intellectual labor, creative labor, was a real form of work, but it never really permeated into the mainstream. To this day, a lot of the time when I talk to people about emotional labor, one of the pushbacks I will get is, how could you say emotions are work? And I will tell you how I can say emotions are work. What's fascinating is that emotional labor is actually now one of the main forms of work in our economy. It's the work that service sector people obviously do, bartenders, restaurant workers, healthcare workers, teachers. It's the kinds of jobs that, unlike physical work and actually now intellectual work, we can't automate. We can't get rid of those kinds of forms of work because so many of us actually enjoy human connections. We might want to replace, I don't know, a waiter, but actually I had a friend in New York who tried to have a startup that was about, putting tabs on tables instead of having restaurant workers or bartenders, servers, and people don't like that. We like the kind of interactive experience between people. That is actually one of the core ways in which we are human, and the core ways in which, as humans, we distinguish ourselves from, I guess, other species in some ways. So a few examples of emotional labor at work is, of course, all of the examples I've given you, but customer care representatives, therapists, the list goes on. In private, emotional labor is really, I think of it as in two ways. It's the very literal emotional labor that maybe a mother will do with her child, or a father will do with his child, of helping a child make sense of the world, help a child feel safe, give a sense of meaning and belonging to a broader group. It's a form of work that in private isn't just feminized, it's also highly devalued. And that is one of the big takeaways. So nowadays, when someone asks me, give me the elevator pitch of what emotional labor is, I will tell them emotional labor is the editing work of feelings you will do on yourself in order to have an effect on the feelings of other people. In our society, this is a form of work that is highly devalued. It's often rendered invisible. We refuse to see it in spite of the fact that it's one of the most important forms of work out there, because it is a form of work that runs families, runs economies, runs communities. It's often highly feminized and racialized, which is how we keep it so invisible, so disparaged. So that's the kind of overview of emotional labor. And I suppose what would be good is, what I thought I could do with the time given is give you a few key takeaways of the book. And I think the first one is to talk about value. There's been incredible progress made in neuroscience over the last 20 years, and there's a lot of studies that really start to see and reveal how important this form of work is. And I found the passage. I was worried I wasn't going to, just because this will do it better justice. Research from the last 4 decades has consistently found that as humans, our existence is primarily reliant on our emotional needs being met. Love, a sense of connection and belonging, could not be more valuable to humans thriving, more so than the food that we eat or the roof over our heads. One analysis that looked at results from 148 studies with over 300,000 participants showed that poor social relationships was a more detrimental factor to human survival than physical inactivity or obesity, and was at least as impactful on health as smoking or drinking alcohol. People with strong relationships had a 50% increased likelihood of survival in a control group than those with weaker social relations. Quite poignantly and directly, social connection or being in community has been found to positively alter and better equip our immune systems. So it even has kind of a very real medical impact.
Can I pop in to disrupt for just a moment? I want to just excuse myself because I'm going to remove myself from the couch. I'm headed to a peer support worker training to co-facilitate that and talk more about emotional labor in community with people who are looking to do support for their peers who are having a hard time, struggling emotionally. Hey, shout out to the topic at hand. It was really lovely to meet y'all, and I hope that you check out our information on the back table and have a great rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
So one of the biggest forms of pushback, as I just mentioned, I get is, how could you consider emotions work? And as I went over, emotions at work everywhere. Emotional labor is the central part of so millions of jobs in this economy, arguably the jobs that are not disappearing. Say to those people, the naysayers, when they push back against me, is I say that if you don't believe it's real, imagine its absence. So imagine a teacher who has no patience with the children in their care. Imagine a nursing assistant who is in a really bad mood and very quick. They would be considered as not having a good bedside manner, not doing their job properly. Imagine a home health aide who refuses to remember any of the details of your elderly parent in their care. That really shows you how crucial emotional labor is across the board. And actually, Amy and I were talking about earlier the way in which we so often separate forms of work in private versus forms of work in public, forms of work professionally that are being done properly in sort of, I guess, remunerated circumstances, and forms of jobs that are being done in private. And with emotional labor especially, there's a huge way in which we render it invisible and devalued, because it is a form of work that we do equate with mothers and sort of private community, and it feels to some almost heresy. Thank you. Heresy to admit that this is a real form of work, and it is. So one of the ways in which, one of the messages I wanted to share today about my research is the fact that emotional labor saying its work is not doubling down on a capitalist system. It's not saying that all emotional laborers should be paid, although maybe they should. It's to say that emotional labor, just like every other form of work, is finite. There's a way in which we can think of it as needing to have a beginning and an end. We wouldn't expect someone cutting down a tree to cut down a tree for 24 hours a day. But with emotional laborers, with the people that we expect in our society to do emotional labor, we expect emotional laborers to be on call 24/7, and that's just not sustainable. So that's one thing I wanted to go over. I think another point that's really important is, I think it's important to point out that emotional labor is something that everyone can do. Girls and then women are trained to do it more than boys and then men. But empathy is a universal, not just trait, but skill that can be practiced and learned, just like any other form of skill. And the fact that it is so gendered in our society not just mean that often we're putting more of the onus on women, it actually means that we're robbing a lot of men of connection to themselves and connection to other people. We're robbing a lot of men of tools to create and foster meaningful relationships. We're often threatening men with the idea that if they do this form of work or practice this skill, that they might be seen as less men, which doesn't really make sense. And to that end, I wanted to read you a quick passage that to me was really fun. I did not expect to have to become an expert in neuroscience, and I'm not, but I did read a lot of papers that I didn't expect to have to do. I was not good at science in school. Empathy is motivational. It's not it's not something that some people have and other people don't. That's what neuroscience really shows us. Actually, I can actually just tell you the summary of the study. It's better. So, what people studying the brain find is that a lot of the time, our brain is incentivized to perform in a certain way and not perform in another way. For women, for girls, we are rewarded if we come across as very other-oriented. We are rewarded if we're kind and put ourselves second. We're rewarded if we do emotional labor, if we put our feelings to the service of other people's feelings, if we put our feelings to the side and center other people's feelings. So when researchers have tried to test empathy, what they have found is that if they queue participants across genders, that they are going to be tested on interpersonal or emotional skills. The people doing this, the people in the research group who are women will do really, really good at the exercise, and the people who are men will not do so well. If they don't cue the participants that they're being tested on interpersonal, very gendered emotional skills, neither men and women do the same, and they don't do terribly well. So that's how researchers started to realize that empathy, emotional labor was something that you could motivate people into doing in different circumstances. And there is this seminal study at the University of Oregon where researchers thought, okay, how can we in this society motivate all participants to be good at interpersonal skills? So they do a first round where they don't tell the participants they're being tested on these gendered skills. People don't do terribly well. They do a second round where they tell people you're being tested on interpersonal skills. And the women do really well, the men don't do so well. And then they do a third round where they tell everyone they're being tested on interpersonal emotional skills. But they also say for every question of empathy that you get somewhat right, you'll be given $1. And for every question that you get fully right, you'll get $2. And I'm sure you can all guess that results go through the roof. Everyone's really good at empathy. You know, and actually the researchers are funny at the end, and they say, you know, if you're trying to get your message across to someone who can't see your perspective, maybe it might be worth throwing them $1. But I think it's really important to say that, because I think the way in which we have hypergendered what is an essential, it's not just a form of work that deserves to be seen and valued, it's an essential form of work that is so central to us as humans. You know, we talk a lot about loneliness, and particularly male loneliness, although there's a lot of lonely women too. And I think that emotional labor, its valuing, its centering is just so critical. There's a longitudinal study that has been happening at the University of Harvard, which maybe some of you are familiar with this study. The study started in the 1930s and took two groups of men, one group that were Harvard undergrads and one group that came from the inner city in Boston. And they decided to study this group of men over the course of the decades of their life, checking in with them every year and seeing how they were doing economically, emotionally, financially, all of it. And they found over the course of the years, as they followed these men, that the highest predictor of how healthy a man was going to be at 80 was how connected that man's relationship was at 50. So it wasn't, did you get your undergraduate degree from this super swanky university? It wasn't, you know, what side of the city did you land on? It was, how strong and positive is your marriage? How strong and positive are your relationships? Yeah, I'm not going to check out my Instagram, but I have notes here to tell you. Sorry. I think a couple of more points that might be good to point out here is one of the ways in which we keep work that is incredibly valuable invisible or disparaged. One of the ways in which we keep people doing really important work on the margins often of society invisible is we have this propensity as a society, as a culture, to hyper celebrate the very people that we are actually exploiting. I think obviously this happens with a lot of mothers. You know, mothers, oh, how extraordinary. She does so much. It's just incredible. You know, it's hard to not think about the way in which during the pandemic, when we were all in lockdown, people in cities across the world came out and we banged our pots and pans to thank healthcare workers, but in this country, federal hazard pay was never passed. People were severely underpaid and risking their lives. Yet we put them on the, front of magazines. And it's almost like a very systemic gaslighting way in which we say we really value people, but we refuse to actually give them the right pay. And there is a way in which this specifically with emotional labor is used, because we put kind of a fake morality of the work that you're doing is so valuable that we can't value it. You're just so valuable, the sense of meaning and belonging and connection that is more important than the food that you eat or having a roof over your head. It's so valuable that it's valueless. And I think that, again, not to double down on capitalism as a solution, but I do think it's important to point out that companies, governments are profiting from the emotional labor that oftentimes is being done at a totally undervalued cost or for nothing at all. The value being created is there. It's just not necessarily being captured and protected by the people who deserve to be valued and have their work and time protected. And this is a great segue into, again, what I mentioned earlier, which is it is also important, I do believe, to think of this as work, whether it's happening in a formal professional setting or outside of a professional setting, because it needs to be treated as finite, but also a great way of measuring emotional labor when dollars aren't really being exchanged is to think about it in terms of time. We all have 24 hours in a day. Emotional labor actually does take time to sit with someone and see how they're doing, to preemptively think through how to organize an event, to even if you're cooking a meal, you might be cooking it for people who have allergies. You might be cooking for someone who needs to be comforted, and you might think about finding their favorite food. This is all very time consuming. And I think it's important, as all of us have to think about how this impacts us and the way in which emotional labor and the degree to which emotional labor ends up ruling our life. But I think to think about it in time and to think about how much time we do have to give and how much time we actually have to keep for ourselves, that's often really important. I feel like I could ramble on for many more minutes, but maybe now is a good time to pause and to start a conversation. Yeah?
Yeah. Again, Amy. I have worked, my professional resume is I'm a person in recovery. I've been sober since 2013. Thank you. I have worked in the treatment courts as a peer since 2016, and I've always held a caseload of around 20 people within that realm, and then I started to work for FAN in 2019, and so I was working with people in both capacities. And when Chris asked me to come speak at this, I looked at, caring for caregivers, and assumed it was the general, how to avoid burnout, the very surface. Get up from your desk every 15 minutes. Make sure you spend time with family, right? Anybody who works in the field knows that that's what our training will say. Go to yoga, eat, pack a nice lunch, right? Take a 5-minute walk. And so I should have known Passenger would do something much deeper and better than that. And I didn't think I needed to do much research. I've seen this, over the span of 8 years, over and over again. Those are the tips. Those are the things for professionals with these really heavy jobs, secondary trauma. And those of us who work in a peer capacity know that job hasn't been around for very long. There aren't too many rules and constrictions on us yet because they haven't really found out a way how to do it exactly. And it's probably coming. But that's a blessing and a curse for us. We were given a lot of freedom to work with our participants and fill gaps for them. And that can include typical working with a participant for me could be something like a phone call. Hey, Amy, this person is being released from jail in about an hour. Can you make it up there? And now this person cannot be released unless I accept them into my care. I need to find food, and it's 2 o'clock. My kids need to be picked up from school at 4, but if I don't do it, this person stays in jail. And it could be the hospital, or a person just calls even in crisis, and the emotional labor that you have to hop into just to figure these things out, and also comfort them, not let them know about your time constraints and the stress that you're under, and not make them feel rushed. And there's just so many different things that are immeasurable. We're paid for our time, and but even if, say, it's a day off and I'm with my family and I'm at a restaurant and I see that they're hiring, I automatically think about the girl that lives nearby that needs this job, and I have to stop and I have to text her, this resource. That's something really cool about what we do, and it's something that can be kind of burdensome. A lot of us work on our own, but there are peers that work with teams, and a therapist, they have pretty strong boundaries. They can't come out from behind that desk. And I personally would hate that. I love that I can pick somebody up from jail and give them a warm handoff into a new life, and but it can be hard, like I said, to set the boundaries. Taking a break and taking a walk and having a nice lunch doesn't usually alleviate all of that. But when I think about emotional labor, I don't think about work as much. I think when I worked in the field early on, I would often, you talk about in your book, trading your comfortability or your emotions for someone else's. I did do that a lot. And I think the one solution that I really came up with is, if it's not in my schedule and somebody asks me if I can do it, and it's both in a work capacity or I'm in a 12-step program, person in recovery, we just want the hand to be there, and service is part of our culture. I ask myself if I really can do it. If I really can do it, because there is an element of shame for not suiting up and showing up for someone. I have to be honest with myself and say, can I really do this? Do I have the physical time and resources to do it? And do I have the emotional capacity to do it? If I really can make it work, I'll do it. And if I can't, I say no. But I really have to be honest with myself about that. But when I think about emotional labor, work isn't my heaviest load anymore. It's when I think about all the titles of the things that I am. I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm a person in recovery, I work in the field. To some people, those may be titles, but they really represent jobs. I work in all of those capacities. I am the main worker, in those capacities. And this topic came to me, I don't know, maybe a few years ago. But it came to me not in emotional labor, but as a mental load. The invisible mental load, maybe I saw something like that on TikTok, and I started to become aware of it. And when I first got married, my husband worked, I had a part-time job, but then I started working 2 jobs. And so that I really started to feel the load that I was, taking care of all of the details. And it's not just, the housework, it's the dentist appointments, doctor's appointments, the dogs, the cats, the kids, the funerals, the birthday parties, making everyone feel welcome, and all of it. And so I said something, I don't remember what I even said to him, but maybe, why don't you do the dishes? And he said something like, well, you enjoy it. And I do enjoy it. I do, I kind of was I do enjoy it. And my husband's a very good sport. If he wasn't stuck at work, he would be here, because he knows this has been a topic in our home. And then I was like, okay. And then I said, I do enjoy it, but not every time, And he started to step up, right? but it was new to him to have to do that, and he felt resentful about that. And so then he would say, well, I helped you. I helped you. I'm helping you. And I thought, why is doing the work around the house helping me? Is that because it's my job? And why is it my job? Because I'm a woman? And he really took that in, being in this field taught me about motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is very helpful at home too. And so that clicked for him too, as it did for me in real time. And so your book talks about default, and that word really stuck with me. Like by default, I am the one to shoulder so many things. And I think it's easiest for me to identify that within my home relationship, like I said, because that burden's so heavy to me right now. And the organization that I work for, FAN, we're over 90% people in recovery. And I don't feel any disparities really there. I definitely don't feel stigma there because of that. And also, I considered 12-step programs. We are all of service. So it can be toxic sometimes, depending on the area that you live. It could be a little shaming if you aren't, but I will say, doesn't matter your gender, we all work equally. So that is something to really be proud of, that our traditions work. There's nobody in power. There are no dues or fees. Nobody has any say over. It really is an even playing field, and I didn't recognize that before, and I really appreciate that. But in default, and it was so funny because he cleaned my daughter's room and my mom was over, and I said, don't mess up your room, Dad just cleaned it. And my mom laughed and said, that sounds funny, Dad cleaned it. And I thought, my dad never helped you, no, he never did dishes, and it even sounds funny to her that Dad cleaned something. And that just really stuck out to me. And just the different demands that are around, and now that I know, listening to Rose's book, I'm going to recognize what that emotional labor looked like. And when I said that I would come speak here, I thought to myself, as it usually works, I'm not really stressed right now. I don't really feel burnt out right now. But I know what it's like to feel that way. I'll be able to relate. And then my daughter got sick. My husband's worked late the past 2 days. I've had to get everybody. I've had to take care of all the tasks, And I was listening to your book, and I was getting mad. I was getting tired, and it's hard because, like I said, I recognized it as the mental load, but to address it and to face it and kind of undo it is more emotional labor. And it's almost easier to continue, right? A body in motion tends to stay in motion than to address each thing. And so one of the questions that I wrote for you before I got too deep in the chapters was, how do we address inequities in emotional labor without offending or accusing someone? And then I heard you say, something to the effect of, that it's emotional labor, trading your emotions and how you feel for somebody else's comfort. And then I thought, well, that question's got to go, And I really stayed out a lot of your solution because I wanted to hear it from you here. And so I was even thinking about when I was a teenager, I grew up with a lot of single women, and they just took care of shit, They took care of everything. And even though I myself would consider myself a woman, an older teenager, when I would spend time at their homes, I didn't pitch in to help them clean, even though that by default happens. And I think it's because they were the matronly figure. So not only does it by default go to you if you're a woman, but if you're a mom especially, the mom, it's your house, it's yours.
Yeah, this is, thank you so much for that. This is actually reminding me of all the things I wish I'd said. So I get to say them now. So one of the ways, if emotional labor isn't inherently gendered, if anyone can do it, why is it that maybe within our families or within our communities we think of it as women doing it primarily? And I think one way in which we can think of emotional labor is not about gender as much as it's about power. And in our society, it's the people with the least amount of power who are expected to do the most amount of emotional labor. And the way in which I explain this in a very sort of simplified way is if you think of, let's say, a corporation or even government, but let's say corporation, the big boss is not going to be expected to have to filter their feelings at all. They might be good at it, but they don't have to. They can scream, they can be, smiley one day and not very smiley the next. No one will really notice, or will certainly be holding them accountable for it. And as you kind of go down in the ladder of hierarchy, you will see just slightly more emotional labor having to be done. A junior associate is probably going to have to placate their boss, the clients, or whatever. But it's not necessarily going to have to placate the junior intern. The junior intern cannot arrive, screaming and yelling and having tantrums and feeling depressed, but then also really happy. They're going to be expected to really shut it and learn and within our families, I think it's really interesting to then think of emotional labor as relating to power, because often within our families, women, mothers, wives, daughters are expected to do so much more of it. And as much as, again, it's that systemic gaslighting I was talking to you about earlier, we laud them for it. It's also really because we disparage them or their work. And so there is a kind of a nefarious effect that's happening. I also wanted to highlight one of, aside from neuroscience, I ended up reading far too much economics books, which is not my thing at all, but now it is. And there's a really cool kind of economic historian called Evelyn Carno-Glenn. I think she's at Berkeley, and she says that care, which in this case to me is emotional labor, unlike any other service, around 150 years ago, let's say, work became seen as part of an exchange. It was no longer just extracted for free. So if you wrote a book, you got to exchange it for, let's say, money or a favor or something like that. If you might cut down a tree for your neighbor, but that's going to be seen potentially as part of an exchange. Obviously, when we go to work, we get paid. The one form of work that didn't transform into the understanding or idea of an exchange was emotional labor. We still attach this form of work with someone's status as a human being. If you are a woman, I expect emotional labor from you. Nothing in exchange, maybe a thank you once a year on Mother's Day, but we just expect it. And to be honest, we also expect it from not just women. We expect it sometimes, from other forms of, other marginalized groups. If you're in a setting where everyone's, very athletic and straight, and you're not particularly athletic and not straight, you're probably gonna have to adapt to the culture in that room, potentially, if that's kind of where the power is. And I think, to go back to Amy's points about the family settings, what's really interesting for me, I think one of the reasons why people started being interested in emotional labor is because increasingly, obviously, it's not just men going out to work, it's women too. So that double standards that may have already been there, status obligations that may have already been there and may have been unfair, ended up just really becoming galling double standards that are now seen. So if a woman and a man are both going out to work, but then when they're getting home, one of them only is doing all the housework, then suddenly that is like, so why am I doing this again? And I think that conversely, the same thing happened in work settings, and I think in a lot of work settings that were not heavy on emotional labor, specific people were expected to do more emotional labor than others, and you started to see that double standard again. the mental load and emotional labor overlap a lot. They're not exactly the same. So I think a lot of the ways in which people talk about the mental load nowadays, it's really the idea that there's someone who's going to be in charge, let's say, of a family setting, and who's going to have a list in their head that's running at all times, that is, got to turn the washing around, is who's going to repair the dishwasher, we've got to get X to this appointment, oh my gosh, you know, Y looks a bit like they're feeling low, I need to check in with them. I also need to make sure that I'm doing my stuff so that I look put together, so that, and that just becomes like an overwhelming amount of pressure that does tend to be put on women who are the kind of default household managers. Not all of those tasks, not all of that labor is emotional, but a lot of the time the people who are doing those tasks are doing it because there is an understanding that they are in charge of communal well-being, communal peace, that they are the ones who should make sure that everyone isn't just feeling good but is fed properly and clothed properly and all of that. Who are the people who are making sure that everyone else is good? When you think about it like that, emotional labor is necessarily in all of those tasks, but it's the reason why the understanding that you bear the load, the emotional load, that you're carrying the emotional well-being responsibility, is why you're then going to probably take the high road. And yes, sure, I will pick, you know, Uncle Joe up and take him to the party even if he doesn't have a car, or whatever it is, and doing all of those things. Yeah, I just had, those were the things that I realized I didn't say that I got to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. And one other thing I wanted to mention that I think working in the field, a lot of us can relate to is the surface acting.
Yeah.
Changing the appearance of emotions rather than what's actually felt, and the research that you found that it actual causes burnout.
Right.
And so we work within a broken system. And so we may be with a participant who already has trouble regulating their emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And so we may take them to court, or they're trying to get a job or a medical appointment, or even with their family, and they can face a lot of outright stigma or other injustices because, you know, we're marginalized groups, and we might have to do a lot of surface acting, not only to keep peace, you know, with the community partners or wherever we are, but we're also tasked with role modeling. That's one of our written tasks. It's in job descriptions. It's part of our training. We have to role model for our participants. And so I don't know about you, but I do a lot of surface acting. And the fact that that causes burnout is very interesting to me.
Yeah. Thank you. So sociologists think of emotional labor broadly in two ways. There's surface acting and then there's deep acting. And deep acting would be almost just transforming, when you're doing that emotional labor of catering to the emotions of the person opposite you, whether it's regulating your emotions so you can help regulate their emotions, manipulating, modulating. When you're doing deep acting, you've almost convinced yourself that this is actually who you are. You're doing it, you're in it. Strangely, that actually leads to less burnout. Certainly in the studies. I don't love that finding, because I think that people doing deep acting are kind of really, really going in, but maybe it's also, you know, I talked about systemic gaslighting. I think one thing that I didn't get to say of my 9 years of research is I've forgotten, because I forgot my point. But I will remember it in a couple of seconds. I was just pondering my life for a second there. I'll go back to deep acting and surface acting. Surface acting, which is you're very aware in the moment that you're having to fake it effectively. That is what does, sociologists find, lead to more burnout, because you are effectively being, I don't remember what I was going to say, you're effectively being alienated from who you are. You're being expected very consciously to have to change who your authentic being is in a way that can feel very discombobulating and therefore lead to much faster burnout. The point I wanted to make was that this is a huge systemic issue, and I know that when Jean and Amy and I talked about what we're going to talk about today, there are some real pragmatic potential questions. One of the problems I'm happy to answer in the best capacity I have as a journalist, not a therapist, what I found. But one of the big problems is that this is systemic. We devalue emotional labor, we devalue emotions, in spite of it being core to who we are as human beings, again, regardless of gender, to such an extent that it's very hard to really put the onus on an individual to solve the problem of a society that pretends it doesn't exist while extracting it constantly and telling the people who are doing it that they're both very important but also not important at all.
Sorry. Yes. And that's how I feel after reading this book. Now that once I'm aware of something, it's like I need to change it for the better. It's more work, right? Like I need to look for it, and I'm gonna be referring back to your book a lot. One of the things that I was thinking was about, you mentioned when some or the people with lesser power is taking on all this responsibility, they do. Not only am I shouldering a lot of the emotional labor, but I also get all of the benefits. And so people the people who are benefiting or the beneficiaries of someone else's emotional labor might not get that connection. It's easiest for me to refer to being a mother, but like if I'm doing all the bath times for 10 years, you missed out on all the bath times. You may relate that to any type of work. If we're dealing with all the direct care and with the participants, the people who they're missing out on getting to know and get deep connections with people. And service is so much a part of like who we are, being of service. It's its own pathway to recovery. It's recognized. Michigan Department of Health and Human Services recognizes giving back like as its own pathway. And so how do we achieve reasonable balance? And recognizing that some of our partners, our work partners, our home partners, they may not operate as efficiently as us because of mental health, or maybe they're not operating as efficiently because they're not used to it, right? And because other people have been doing it. What's reasonable expectation, and how can we achieve balance?
I love that question. So I think the most important thing, when I first started looking into this topic in 2015, the people who'd written about it were talking about going on emotional labor strike. There was actually a really kind of, to me, fascinating and neat detail to how this topic permeated the mainstream, which was through basically an online community of a subsection of sex workers called FinDoms, financial dominatrixes. So financial dominatrixes effectively would have clients who they would extort in a way that was very pleasing to the clients, obviously. And part of what they said is, you want to even interact with me, you've got to pay me. You want to say hello to me, I'm not even saying hi to you until you've, the equivalent at the time, Venmo'd me $25. They started a hashtag that the hashtag was "Give Your Money to Women," and they were highlighting actually the non-stop emotional labor that women were so often expected to give society, and especially in romantic situations or intimate situations. Men, there is a kind of an idea in heterosexual dynamics that men go to women expecting to be pleased in many ways, and in all of those ways are expressions of emotional labor. And so when I first started looking into it, emotional labor, a lot of people were saying, let's just stop doing it. But very quickly, and this is why I really tried to highlight just how valuable it is, very quickly it struck me that going on strike was a great way of showing how much so many of us depend on emotional labor, need emotional labor, but actually it wasn't a long-term solution because we need it, and it's, as you're saying, it's not just something that is valuable to the person receiving it. It's actually, when done in an ideal situation, it's actually very rewarding to the person doing it too. So what does a what does an ideal emotional labor situation look like? It's not an interaction between two people who are refusing to do emotional labor for each other. It's not like, you don't say hi in a nice way to me, so I'm not going to say hi in a nice way. That's not terribly exciting as an interaction between two people. The ideal would be not even a kind of a tit for tat. It would be something outside of the way in which we do think of work in this current system, which would be an idea of open-ended mutuality. So I am being really kind to you and preemptively thoughtful to you, not expecting an immediate return, but trusting that you are going to have my back in that same way, and in fact are going to, buoyed by how uplifted by how good your emotional labor made me feel, I might go and do it to someone else. And again, not be counting, but understanding, because we now live in a society that actually sees and values this kind of work. I'm not worried about having my back. And in fact, one of the biggest aha moments I had researching this book was when people were asking me, should we pay for emotional labor? Is it even real? I did a deep dive into the history of money. And anthropologists of money, when they go back to the beginning of money, they don't find, we're taught, with the story we're all taught if we're unlucky enough to take economics in high school or college or whatever, is that it's the one Adam Smith invented. He invented this idea that there's a kind of amorphous medieval town that to me always seems a bit like the Beauty and the Beast at the beginning, and there's no money in this town, just lots of people with skills who do different things. There's like a bookstore, and there's like someone who's repairing shoes, and someone who's has a cow with milk. And when I want shoes and I have my cow with milk, I go and say, I'll give you 4 liters of milk and you can give me shoes. And that's the barter system. And we're told that the origin of money is the barter system. And then when this quote unquote double coincidence of needs doesn't happen anymore, when we don't have the perfect exchange to give to the shoemaker and the shoemaker doesn't want milk, then we introduce coins that then we can use as a way of exchanging between human beings. There's no evidence of this ever having happened except for in situations where money was already there and it's taken away. So in incarcerated situations, barter is big. In times of war, barter is big. People don't have access to money in the traditional sense, so they figure out ways of exchanging goods. The history of money is actually much more markers of relationships. So I meet Amy through Jean. I give my pen to Amy at the end of our encounter as a marker of today and this relationship and this event. Amy keeps this pen as a marker of this relationship and maybe gives Jean a notebook. These are all symbols that don't just tie us to one another, they are symbols of social indebtedness. So that maybe down the line, I have a cousin who needs a lift from the airport or from an incarcerated situation, and I think Amy is going to be a good person to call. And Amy has the pen that is the symbol of this open-ended indebtedness. The history of money is open-ended mutual emotional labor. The history of interactions between people is the idea of relationships bonding us to one another so that we want to show up for one another. We've been completely, as time has come on, we've been divorced from that. So it's not even the question of should we pay for emotional labor. It's like emotional labor is fundamentally the most human of currencies in many ways. So it's like going back to your question of what in a house. I think the thing to remember, that there are a few things to remember. One, none of this weaponized incompetence, we're all capable of doing emotional labor. So if someone says, oh, you're good at this, it's like how are you not good at doing dishes? How are you not good at asking me how my day was and trying to not be in a terrible mood? you have you have struggle, you struggle with being up or being down, like that's something you can work on, because we all have to work on it. So there's a kind of a degree of accountability for all of us need to take within a setting. And then there's a kind of a balance, to my mind, between accepting that you are responsible for your emotions, and also accepting that you are also part of an emotional network that you do not get to abstain from, because you're benefiting from the emotional network. So it's the balance is, I, individual, have to regulate my emotions and think of other people and do the dishes or whatever it is. But I also, actually do the dishes would be communal. So I, individual, am responsible for myself. But also, I, individual, am a part of this emotional network. So I have to show up for that emotional network. And in an ideal setting, all the other individuals are doing that too. So there's a kind of a balance that forms itself. Now, the problem in the way in which we live is that we expect some people to do a lot of emotional labor, and we actually let a lot of people off the hook. We'll say, oh, they're just not good at remembering things. How are you a lawyer who's not good at remembering things when you're out, it's like really good in the courtroom, but terrible, when you're suddenly within your family setting? No, you're kind of letting yourself off the hook. Is that, yeah. I feel like I went all over the place.
That was okay. So it makes me think probably everybody in the room has identified probably an area of their life where there's like emotional labor in that dynamic, and like for me it's personally like my household, and so when you think about wanting to explain it to that person, I have like empathy and sympathy, because I only can understand this because I'm experiencing it. Like I have a really hard time learning about things that I haven't experienced, and it also gives me a greater sympathy and empathy for like people of color, and the work that it is to explain system, and how it's not their responsibility to like explain that to us. It kind of feels like it's not my responsibility to explain it to you, but also how are you going to understand if I don't? And I love what you said about it's never too late to negotiate, like within relationships. And so it's like, okay, how am I going to explain? But then why do I even care? Because that's exchanging my emotion for yours. And then it's just so the path ahead.
I guess, one of the people I interviewed talked about the labor that she had to do. She is a trans black woman, and she talked about the labor she had to do in intimacy. She has sex with straight men, and she described the way in which often at the end of intimate encounters she felt in danger, because a lot of men suddenly had moments of feeling very, very shamed and shameful, and potentially she realized in those moments that they could take it out on her. And so she had to do a huge amount of labor, emotional labor, to help them through this moment in a way that was obviously not just because she was showing up for them in that moment, but also because she had to protect her own safety. And she's the one who told me this. I mean, it's a harsh truth, and I guess we can all decide where we fall on it. But, she said, I used to think that progress happened just naturally over time. That Martin Luther King quote of the moral arc of the history is long, but it bends towards justice. This idea that we're just naturally somehow going to go towards a better world. And she said, after she started having more and more of these intimate encounters, she realized that actually no, the world gets better through a lot of labor. And sometimes it's borderline coercive labor in her sense. She felt like she didn't have a choice. And she thought the way in which she ended up making sense of it or making peace with it was she thought, I'm also doing this for the next trans woman that this man has sex with, so that he's, you know, he's processed more of this, and he also understands, you know, his notions of consent have been expanded, and many things like that. And I mean, that's obviously a very stark example, but I think that, to my mind, the idea that that progress just happens is not feasible. Sadly, I think it takes labor, and ideally, we figure out ways that are not coercive, and that are consensual, and that are celebrated in a way that's not lauding to then make invisible. And so I do think that that's the kind of labor that is worth it, because it's worth it because you're helping someone. Not just it's the, you know, it's also that metaphor of, you know, teaching a person how to fish versus handing them a fish. You know, this is actually it's sort of real justice work. You know, that you're helping someone not just do the dishes once, but understand why it's really important for them to think of, you know, this community as something that they're also responsible for. They don't just get to, you know, go in and go out and help every now and then. But this is actually kind of a mutually, you know, responsible situation. So I think there is, you know, that labor is kind of inevitable, but ideally that labor then, you know, you really get to see the fruits of it.
Yeah. I think we can open it to any questions in the room. Anybody has any questions for Rose?
I guess I do. Outside of like the gender part of it, is it possibly something why it's not valued as much is because it's like, oh, well, you know, you're just being a good human, you should be doing that, you shouldn't expect compensation. You know, does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, that's kind of the argument of like, it's so valuable that it's impossible to value it accurately. I would say in work situations, it's just objectively creating value. You know, like if you're a server in a restaurant, and actually the tipping system in this country is a perfect actually example of the ways in which we are so hypocritical with emotional labor, that we require it, we need it, but then we're like, oh, we don't have to pay for it. So if you're a restaurant owner and you have a server or servers working for you, in most places in this country, you don't have to pay them a full wage. You pay them a sub-minimum wage, and they then have to be really good at their jobs. But what makes a good server? Again, it's like the flight attendant. It's not whether or not he got the Diet Coke, you know, order right. It's whether or not he was pleasant. It's like, exactly. Hi, how's it going? You know, if let's call him George. If George is having a bad day, like really feeling terrible, his cat is not going to make it, and it's horrible, and he comes to work, and you know, you come in, and you're like, George says, hello, how are you? Take a seat, and then you're like, I'm good. How are you doing? And George is like, I am feeling shit. My cat's doing terrible. I think that death is upon us all, and it's like, you know, you're going to be a bit frazzled, and you're going to think George is doing a terrible job. So George has to do a good job to get tipped. Yeah. So it's like, is George just being a good human being, so he doesn't deserve to get paid for that emotional labor that he's doing? No, I mean, yes, this form of work is effectively being a good human being, and that is the service that people are kind of expecting, and then going to be, you know, hopefully rewarding George for. You know, there's also, I know you said outside of gender, but I think gender is so, we think of emotions and emotionality in such a gendered way, it's hard to extract it from emotions. There is a way in which we think of feminized skills as just, whether a man or a woman is doing it is not really kind of worthy of seeing it as work, and we don't think of the same when we think of like skills that are seen as manly or gendered in that way. So if you think about math, rationality, you know, it's such a fake paradox, but we think of, in this society, we think of men and rationality going together and women and emotionality and going together, as if, you know, I don't know, as if as humans we just get, half of us can't be logical, and anyway, but we don't have any trouble if you're naturally good at math and you're a man, and then you go and work in a bank. We're not like, you're naturally good at math and you're a man, so you don't deserve to be paid in your bank job. We actually pay you hugely.
Yeah.
But if you're naturally good at emotions, a people pleaser, and you know, you go and work as a nursing assistant, we're going to be like, oh, you're just being a good person, and you're kind of a woman. This is kind of what you're good at, right? So why should you be paid more than $20,000 a year? And I mean, I think to be honest, it's a really, you know, you kind of got to the heart of why we're so stuck, and also why, not just why women struggle underneath, a lot of us struggle underneath this invisible burden, but also why so many men are sadly kind of either kept out of it or struggle to feel like they can engage with any of these kinds of topics or skills.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
Mm-hmm.
Can we keep talking about George real quick?
Yes.
Okay, so I want to think of George's. So this is what happened in my head in real time, and I want to say it out loud so we can but like the notion of the surface acting and the deep acting, right? George knows how to surface act because George needs that tip money,
Yes.
right? But when George has to work 60 hours a week
Yes.
to make that tip money,
Yes.
that surface acting now becomes deep acting.
Yeah.
Because George can't even spend the emotional capital on being conflicted, right? George can't have two identities now.
For sure.
George now has to be
Right.
this George. Is that
Yes. And,
okay?
and honestly, I mean, I gendered George obviously man because I thought it was more
George
interesting.
can be a girl's name.
But exactly no. But I think that a lot of women I interviewed. I did not just interview women for this book. But a lot of women I did interview said, you know, explained to me the 5 different jobs that they were responsible for doing, and all of the different ways in which they were overwhelmed, burnt out, felt like they were on the edge. And then at the end they would say, well, I'm a people pleaser, so it's kind of my problem, right? And that's, I think, where we get to the systemic problem that's not even just about individuals, is we do end up embodying these traits and skills that are expected of us. And then instead of understanding it as very extractive or unfair, we end up blaming ourselves. When actually it's a total setup. You know, we want, let's say, George, you know, in this economy doesn't come, you know, didn't get to go to college, doesn't come from a super wealthy or privileged background at all. Like, we don't want George to think that she or he cares, she or he matters. We want them to think that they're just like there to serve other people, and if they feel burnt out, it's on them because they're people pleasers, and that's kind of what happens to them. To be honest, tipping is also really interesting because it kind of goes, it really exposes this idea of status obligations, and it takes us almost to like a medieval kind of exchange where, you know, George is going to have to put up with a lot. It's not just George is going to have to appear very happy. Is that if a customer, you know, feels George up, do they say something, or do they, you know? And again, that's where you kind of have power come in, and where it ends up being a lot of it's not just originally who has less power is expected to do it the most. It ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy of you feel even more disempowered, even more alienated, even more like you don't matter, or you don't get to say, you know, to be authentically who you are. That's a bit grim.
Capitalism is grim.
But it can also be lots of joy, and you know, I think one of the really positive things that I took away from all the research that went into this book was just the idea that as humans, one of the things that really is awe-inspiring to me is we're always able to grow. You know, that that was the neuroscience kind of big takeaway is the brain is able to create new neural pathways. It's able to develop new skills. It's the adage of you can't teach an old dog new tricks is not true. You know, there's so much that we are as humans, you know, so able to learn and to practice and to develop all these new skills, including emotionality, empathy, connection, all of that. That was really exciting to me. You know, the idea that it was so distinctly a better interpersonal relationships that weren't extractive was just within reach for all of us.
I think we have time for one more question.
What type of like communicational skills have you like researched or has like been beneficial in connecting interpersonally with yourself, but also with others, like like nonverbal to verbal, spoken, written, motivations of like internally within you, or like your intentions, relation to like your actions and behaviors and stuff like that.
I think all of those are relevant. I guess after 7 years of research I stopped, and I did not kind of break it down in that way. I think all forms of communication are relevant here. There's, again, back to neuroscience. As humans, our emotions mirror the emotions of other people. So however someone is expressing themselves, whether it's obviously, you know, a lot of it is not just language, it's body language, it's face, maybe it's just even,
Tone.
Exactly, all of that. All of those are relevant, and there's, it's called mirror interoceptors, is what we have, that if someone is just even giving a peaceful energy, you know, we will respond to that. Anyone who's spent time around a baby, you know, really can feel that happening. So I don't think there's any form of communication that's off the table. I think it's, you know, it's all of it. Yeah, but thank you for your question. I'm sorry if I didn't fully get into details.
No, you're good.
Thank you.
I think we're going to wrap up, and all of us are going to stick around and please network and look at some of the resources that we have in the back. I'll be here. I think Rose will be here, and let's everybody thank Rose.
Thank you.